what I wanted to talk about was, have we really got the management and the organisations for AI and the way it's starting to emerge? And what I wanted to do was to just spend a bit of time showing you how I think it's emerging and some of the impacts it's having, and also starting to think about what some of the challenges really are for businesses. And maybe we can start some conversation maybe over the break about why we think businesses are not starting to tackle some of the impacts of AI, particularly on their organisations and their talent and their workforce, perhaps as quickly as we might have expected. So one of the things I thought it would be interesting to start to think about is the competing agendas, or the agendas that are sort of in tension together. So you could argue at the moment, if you thought about the world and think about ubiquity and technology, I'll make some words up now, technology ubiquitousness. And if you just think about that sort of a few years ago, maybe when some of us were planning strategies and maybe planning some strategies for corporates or businesses, we thought about, not that long ago, just network connectivity being ubiquitous. But now when you start to think about ubiquity and you think about payments, you think about the fact that now you can do payments in real time and any time and anywhere you like. You think about whenever you want to do something, what do? You sort of get on the web and Google, how do I do this or how do I do that? And it's YouTube. So almost like knowledge is kind of starting to become much more ubiquitous than it certainly was. And things like resources, if you want somebody to do something, can somebody fix this? Where do I find somebody that's an expert in that? So almost like resourcing is becoming not just ubiquitous, but globally ubiquitous. And I think you can start to think about a lot of other things, connectivity, be it travel, be it where somebody can work, remoteness, all of that is starting to. So you've got this sort of backdrop. And against that backdrop, which is a much richer backdrop than certainly, like I say, it was a few years ago, you've got businesses busily trying to work out, well, actually, I used to do this, but what do I now do in this world that's starting to change? And you've got businesses that are actually starting to have a tenure much shorter than they ever did. I mean, a lot of us maybe started work thinking, well, actually, I might end up working for this company for the next 30 plus years, just for argument's sake, because that's how long companies lasted those days. But now you can end up with a career where you've worked at lots of places, and that's not just because you're like me that you sort of go from place to place. It's actually the companies you've been working for become taken over and they disappear. I used to work for a company called BG Group, which was a big group, but suddenly that was taken over by Shell. I worked for another company that was taken over. So that actually the tenure of companies is changing and how long they last is changing. And then you've got this other tension, you could argue, of, people are still driving for results. Do it cheaper, do it better, do it faster, do it whatever. And in a world where, as I was saying, this capability is also being disrupted, and, technologies like AI are disrupting that even further. And I don't think I did these slides, so I might not got the build right. And then you start to talk to line of business people, like, I kind of do quite a lot. And you talk to the salespeople where we want a better experience. And you talk to, CIOs who are, how do I get more data into my business? And then you start to talk to the CEOs, and they're busily wondering, well, hang on a minute, I know that everything's changing. How on earth do I fund innovation, and how do I fund doing things differently? So all the time there's almost like this tension. And you've got CFOs that are saying, well, actually everything would be all right if I could see the business in real time. Why can't I do, a soft close on my business every day, every afternoon? Why can't I see what's going on? Why can't I see how profitable projects are and be able to reallocate resources based on that? So lots of questions going on, and a lot of these questions coming from lines of business. But I might argue that all that starts to do is to cause line of businesses to start questioning other lines of businesses with this do it faster, do it cheaper sort of mantra. And then you start to look at technology, and for us, if you're as old as I am, you've lived through all of this, and you start to see the eras of compute, let's call them that, and how it's changed. And think about, actually how good mainframes and PCs were, but they were kind of catering for a much more industrial era where people were doing lots of data processing, lots of straightforward compute. And, slowly we got a bit more sophisticated and we started asking computers to do, business process automation. And now we're starting to think, actually, the whole cloud, mobile and big data, we started thinking, well, actually, we want to ask harder questions into our businesses. We want more analytics about our businesses. We want to ask these harder questions. And then, you start to get machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all of those things appear. And Alex talked about it briefly in his introduction. On one level, machine intelligence is just as simple as the macros a lot of us have often written to make things just go faster at one level. But artificial intelligence is actually starting to watch what people do, automate it, and actually start to get a bit better at it. Machines are suddenly better at matching invoices than humans are. I wonder why that is. Probably matching invoices gets pretty boring after a while. Some machines are better at doing that. And then you've got things like IoT starting to appear, and smart IoT. Not just like the camera I have in my garage that notices who goes in and drinks all the pop. But, IoT, I do actually, yeah. IoT that actually, I've been working with a supplier, for example, who has got assets, big fridges, big freezers where they keep lots of goods. And we're getting to the stage now where the IoT can work out the health of the fridge. It can work out how much stock's in the fridge. It can work out where that stock can go to. It works out if the fridge is broken. It calls an engineer. It's already triaged the fault. The engineer's fixed it. Then it works out how much stuff's been wasted. Then it decides, actually, I can now pay the engineer because I'm happy I'm back in service. And then it can also work out all this wasted goods. Actually, I've worked out there's a customer down the road that could take those goods, or maybe there's a food bank or whatever, depending on the policies down the road that could take that. So suddenly you've got actually pretty smart IoT, starting to do some of the things that service engineers used to do, and that, companies had their whole businesses vested in, those types of activities. So this is where I think it starts to get, quite interesting when you start to look at what's actually going on in terms of how this is contributing to value creation in businesses. And, you can start to see automation starting to go up. You can start to see repetitive tasks come down, and then higher value outcomes potentially starting to go up. Because, if you've got somebody in the form of artificial intelligence sort of doing all the groundwork for you, doing lots of analysis, then you could argue that the things that are sort of left for humans to do is to start thinking up, well, what's the smart thing to do with that data? And what's the smart question we now need to ask as a result of having seen all that data? So I think what it starts to do is turn things quite on its head. And if you can see some of these statistics up at the top, there's a school of thought that says something like 60% of some of these tasks down here are going to be fully automated by 2021. So if you're maybe a company that relies on revenue from doing people's tax returns or auditing and all of those sorts of things, you could actually argue that a lot of that base business could actually be automated out. And there is a school of thought that says that some of those jobs will be hit first, with something like 94% of, for example, tax auditors, being hit by this type of trend. It's quite interesting to think about. And then you sort of get to the fact that actually the machines are becoming better at voice recognition than we are. They reckon that humans can only achieve 95%, and some of the machines, even though you might not think it, they're achieving 99. And I know, I think we're all getting a lot more comfortable with that as well. I know I certainly talk to the car, and it seems to operate the sat-nav much better than I can. So I think that's probably a win. So, I think the other thing that's really important to put as a sort of data as to why companies are in a bit of stasis around what's going on and what their strategies should be, is because digital transformation is just not one thing, and it's just not impacting industries exactly the same. For some companies, You know, if you're in higher education and mining and chemicals and things like that with IoT and all those things, you know, you're really in the maelstrom with it. But with some of these other industries, it's even worse. You know, as we were saying before, well, Josh was saying before, you know, places like banking and things like that. You know, the impact of this and the potential to be disrupted through people that can get quicker, faster, better at delivering customer experience is just quite mind-blowing for them, I think. And I think there's also this mindset. You know, digital transformation's got a lot to do with mindset. Is that, you know, we've brought people up over the past few years to think about things like compute and processes as probably much more centralised. And I think probably where we're heading to now is the fact that the compute's good enough now that we can actually think about much more different architecture models, and we can actually start to think about how we can actually federate things in a way we never thought we could. I know, Josh, you might be a fan of data lakes and things, but I'm not. You know, and I might argue actually we need to get much smarter at what data we can leave at the edge and how we can actually interpolate it and then, you know, bring it to the centre. And then, as I say, you know, digital transformation is just not one thing. And, you know, it's easy for people to say, well, you know, you're an interesting business. You should start be thinking about how you convert the things that you do into products and then convert them into services. But depending on how you look at it, if you're an enterprise and you're thinking about, well, how do I tackle this at an enterprise level, it's actually quite different to tackling it at a line of business level. And I think that's why I come back to this fact that strategy and capability or execution through your capability, there's great tension between the two. And probably what we need to think harder about is how we think about how we tackle that tension. But the thing I wanted to perhaps spend a bit more time on is this delivering results in a capability constrained world. And so you could argue, perhaps if I just go to this slide first and then come back to that one. So if you think about that diagram I had about the way things are automating, you could actually start to argue that as artificial intelligence starts to get smarter and automate things out, what you're actually starting to do is move from a world where management was probably, you know, in probably the 60s, 80s, a lot of management was around making sure people did things right and did them repetitively right, you know, and people were manufacturing things, making widgets, doing things. It was very transactional. So you could argue that management was about hierarchy, it was about making sure people showed up on time and did it. But then as you start to move to the right and as things start to change a bit and get more automated, we've gone down this avenue of efficiency and this cost play. But then you start to get 2000s, 2010, people have started to think, well, how can I actually start to make products out of the things that I do, and how can I start to think about that? And I think that's at the same time as you're starting to get, you know, digital natives entering the workforce. Yeah? And I can remember when I started at SAP, it was quite interesting because I sort of showed up and I put, you know, all my pens on my desk, and I said to somebody that was perhaps a bit like you, Josh, if you don't mind, and I said, could you go and get me all the data on this and the data on that and the data on the other? And this person turned around to me and said, can't you just Google it? Can't you do it yourself? Which was actually a really interesting point to make, because their attitude coming into the workforce was, actually, why shouldn't a company or why shouldn't this environment I'm working in just be like my life, and I can just search it like I can do the internet and search it like I can Google? So why is that? My mindset was, the data's all going to be in silos, right? So I'm going to have to get somebody to get it me all and stitch it all together. So the point being that the people starting to come into the workplace then had very different expectations of it, and also very different expectations about how they would be managed and how they would be expected to work and do things, and the equity they would have in that. Because I think, you know, some of the things that Josh talked about, you know, people's expectations of people being clear about purpose and sharing has changed. You know, maybe I'll speak for myself. Maybe when I came out of university, I was glad to have a job and they gave me money and I could have a car, you know, and that was just fantastic. But I think, expectations have changed now. When I talk to some of the folks I work with, they're saying to me, well, tell me where this project fits in with the strategy. Tell me, how it's going to turn out, and tell me what my share in it's going to be. So, life's quite different, I think. And then I think as you start to get even further to the right, it's how are we going to equip people working in this environment that's probably going to be much more automated. Management installed base is going to be much, much thinner. So spans and control much bigger. And actually, the sorts of jobs that they're going to be doing, what are they going to look like? So if you argue that you've automated a lot of things in an enterprise, and we've got lots of analytical data potentially, then you could argue that the way businesses are going to compete going forward is not just to be analytical, but to be much more predictive about what they do, how much they make. When I talk to CEOs, for example, a lot of them say to me, I'm not bothered about the technology. Well, I'd just like to close the gap between orders and what we're making and how we're fulfilling. So actually you start to say, well, the smart questions that we're going to want people in the workforce to start asking are going to be more about the predictability of business, how we can make business more responsive. And I think it's quite a different skill set, to be honest. I shouldn't have done that. I've done something terrible. bad skill set. So if I come back to, what I think the next generation practices are going to look like, then you start to say, well, it is more about visibility of patterns of what's going on, more about focus, this agility to be able to change business, to be able to customize goods to order, very different type of capabilities. And, then you start to get to the right where you're sort of saying, well, how do we start to think about how we not just have better people, cheaper, commoditized tasks in businesses, but how do we start to reinvent new business streams? And I'm not saying I have all the answers to this, at all, but what I would say is that I think the challenges are probably in these sort of three categories. Mindset, how do you measure performance in this new sort of world? And like I said before, ownership and accountability, how do you start to think about that in quite a different way? And I don't think we've got a lot of the answers yet, but certainly, some of the things that we were talking about, and maybe some of the products and services that are starting to come out through entrepreneurs and different people are starting to perhaps embody this mindset. So then you might argue is, well, how do we make businesses and the workforce perhaps start to catch up with that? Oh, and there's the stat that half of the companies on the 2010 S&P are likely to left it. It probably says about 2025 below. So, I think that's the sort of backdrop that we're going against. And, and like I say, if you start to think about leadership in all of that, top down is certainly not going to work. And, one of the words I put in this was lateral leadership. And that means, leading from the side. It means really coaching people in a different way. It means interacting in a different way and measuring people's performance in a different way. And I think that, we really do need to start thinking about how we get a grip of that, because I think otherwise, how are we going to build this pipeline for this, I call them the yellow jobs that are going to start appearing pretty quickly. I talked to quite a few people that are busily thinking about how they can create adjacent capabilities. So people that have perhaps got, like CIOs, for example, the first question they always ask me is, well, it's great talking about the cloud and it's great talking about automation, but what do I do with my team? And then you talk to them and you say, well, what sort of things can they do? Well, they can analyse networks, they can analyse those sort of things, they've got those sorts of skills. So then your argument becomes, well, actually, can you find adjacencies where those analysis skills coupled with something else start to help them to ask different questions and ask questions that matter, that mean you can be more successful in your business. And I think the other thing that starts to happen, we've seen quite a few incidents recently where we had Barclaycard recently, we had TSB, and people say, oh, this is terrible, living on a cloud's not going to work, and the new environment's not going to work. But actually, you might argue that maybe some of those failings, don't quote me on this, some of those failings have perhaps been because people haven't perhaps looked at the questions they should be asking enough and actually thought about, with agility and 24/7 comes real resilience and a different type of resilience compared to what we've seen previously. With your business, Josh's business, his app's going to be expected to be out there 24/7. If I'm on the tube and I can't get in, I can't score my points, well, I'm going to get a bit upset. So resilience, I think, starts to take quite a very different way, and it's not good enough for us to say, well, we're going to get lots of innovative people in the workforce. We've still got to measure them, I think, particularly on things like resilience and how fit for purpose the outcomes are. So leading from the side, I mean, there's quite a lot of data on this, but if you actually look at some of the skills, the creative thinking and all of those skills, they're actually quite different. And I think training for those, we need to start now. And that's one of the things I've put up here. Businesses are prevaricating, and I think they're prevaricating because they can't get the strategies straight. They can't think about how they're going to release money to actually start to innovate. And they keep prevaricating. And I think the other thing to think about with AI is start small, break out on a project, maybe a business initiative that's small, and then you can grow it and scale it. And then if you're not happy, scrap it. Because at the end of the day, at least you'll start to realise the skills, the management skills, and the capabilities you need actually to be successful in it. And, you've got to admit, if you stalled in your business, or, well, I don't know where this is going, I don't know the impact AI is going to have, and then you get to a stage in 10 years' time where you've really got no skills, it's going to be very expensive to sort of make all the workforce redundant and start again, particularly when the youngsters and the younger people coming in with some of these skills will know how valuable they are. They won't be like people like me, for example, that were just glad to have a job when they got out of university. They'll be choosier. So I think that it's really, really a really interesting dilemma and really an interesting puzzle that, like I say, I haven't solved, and neither have a lot of other people. I was talking to people from professional services this week, and they're really grappling with what happens to their businesses when you've got ubiquitous resources and contingent labour, and actually they've got a lot more competitors on different price points and from different sources. And then I think the final thing is, this point I was making about how can we actually start to get our organisations fitter so that the new skills coming into the workforce can work with data across our organisations, and how can we make those organisations much better from a data availability point of view, because otherwise I don't see how we can start to be predictive. So then you argue that AI really does just become about doing people out of jobs. And I think that's the big fear that everyone's talking about. And yet, I think I would argue that actually putting people out of some of the more repetitive jobs, rethinking cost bases and business models actually starts to develop opportunities for new and different jobs. And that, I could argue that businesses now almost need to start hiring for the corporate planners of the future that perhaps have got a different corporate planning mindset that can start to be helping them with, one-year strategies to address some of this. So, like I say, I haven't got all the answers for it, but I did think that you would be interested to see some of these statistics and just get a sense of what's going on, and a sense of the fact that it's not good to just keep hanging around and waiting. I think my message would be we need to hang around and get doing, and that was really what I was going to say. We have to have a Dilbert at the end, which sort of is probably how it's done now. Right. All right.